And we're back, and we're talking about how the ovarian hormones, the neurotransmitters, interact during the female cycle. So I wanted to start off again by just summarizing what's happening in the front half of the cycle and what's happening in the back half of the cycle. So in the front half of the cycle, we are going to be estrogen dominant. In the back half of the cycle, as shown in the yellow, we are going to be progesterone dominant. All right, so progesterone is listed here in the yellow, and estrogens are listed here in the green. There's a lot of different things going on in regards to neurotransmitters as listed right here. Okay, so the two neurotransmitters that we're going to be looking at is going to be dopamine, and the second one is serotonin. So dopamine, this is our reward pathway neurotransmitter. So this is when we do something and we feel good about what we did, and it's kind of like the reward pathway. Whereas we can think of serotonin a little bit more in regards to like our feel-good pathway or hormone. And these two hormones have different effects within the body that we're going to talk about. But more importantly, it's actually the ovarian hormones, which I will underline here. The ovarian hormones have an effect on both our dopamine, our reward pathway, and our serotonin synapses, our feel-good pathway. So in the front half of the cycle, like I had mentioned, we are estrogen dominant, okay? So remember, this is 0 to 14 days. That's this right here. We'll actually go back, make that green. So 0 to 14 days, the front half of the cycle is going to be estrogen dominant. And in the back half of the cycle, which we're going to show in yellow, we are progesterone dominant. All right. So, in the front half, what we're seeing is we're estrogen dominant, and we're going to see an increase in dopamine. We're going to see an increase in serotonin. We actually see an increase in leptin and leptin resistance. And this all results in an increased appetite control. So you can think about the front half of the cycle as being a lot more easy breezy than the back half of the cycle. What we're seeing, so estrogen is going to, again, it's going to increase dopamine transmission, dopamine synthesis, so we just have more of a good reward pathway hormone floating around, and it decreases the uptake, but it blunts MOA, so we don't really need to know that, so you can kind of just disregard that comment. And it increases the total amount of receptors of dopamine. So we just have overall an increase in dopamine and dopamine efficiency. And then when we look at estrogen in regards to serotonin, a lot of you have probably heard about 5-HTP, and 5-HT synthesis goes up. And again, this is involved in just overall feelings of goodness and being happy. We don't really need to go over the rest of what's kind of talked about here. The main things here is that you get an increase in dopamine, increase in serotonin, increase in appetite control, and we have better cognitive oversight because we're just thinking better. Dopamine, again, within inside the prefrontal cortex, which is basically the structure of our brain that helps us make really good decisions and kind of overrides what we would be, maybe we would call it our like lizard brain. So our prefrontal cortex kind of keeps our lizard brain, or all of the things that we do that we don't really think about, in control. Now in the back half of the cycle, when we have progesterone as the dominant ovarian hormone. So what happens here is that we get an increase of, where am I looking? We have a decrease of dopamine in the prefrontal cortex. So we just talked about this. So this is going to decrease our ability to have cognitive oversight. That's the first thing. We have increased appetite. And again, part of that's because of the prefrontal cortex. The ventral medial hypothalamus, so that's regarded to as this right here. So that is very strongly related to finding food. So if we have a decrease in serotonin there, it's going to increase our appetite, and we're going to seek out food more. That's essentially the easy explanation of what's going on there. We have an overall decline in dopamine and serotonin. So we just have an overall decline in feeling rewarded and feeling good. Okay? And then we just have an overall decrease in appetite control. Now remember from the last lesson is that in the back half of the cycle, we're not as good at dealing with carbohydrates. And if we have a decreased appetite control, and the way that glucose works on the brain, it definitely does give us a little bit of a reward pathway. So what we end up doing in the back half of the cycle, and this is the crazy thing about this, is that we're going to want more hyperpalatable foods. And what I mean by hyperpalatable foods is carbs plus fats and things that are generally very, very high in calories. And we talked about this in the last lesson as well, is that with an increase in core temperature, okay, we should see an increase in BMR. And this, again, is going to be, this is all based on the fact that if we had at the 14-day mark or somewhere in this range here, if we did have fertilization of the egg, it makes sense. It totally makes sense that we're going to increase our calories because we're now eating for 2. So all of this stuff makes sense in regards to reproduction. But when we're trying to lose weight, it's kind of everything's working against us in the back half of the cycle. So when we're progesterone dominant, we're just not feeling as good. We don't have as much reward pathways from dopamine. We don't have as much feel-good pathway from serotonin. We have an increase in appetite, partially because your BMR is up, partially because of your hormones, partially because of both the estrogens and the progesterones and the dopamine and serotonin responses. We're not thinking as clearly. We don't know how to control our food as much. So this just leads us to this whole idea of we have to be super consistent. And we have to have really good habits in place. Because if we don't have these two things, you can see how this is all kind of working against us in the back half of the cycle. Sad face. It's just not really working with us if we want to lose body fat. So we have to be consistent. We have to have good habits, because when we get into these 2 weeks in the luteal phase, we are not going to have the same amount of control that we had in the first 2 weeks of the cycle. So this is something that's happening for pretty much all females, and it's something that we cannot really do anything about. So we're going to have to deal with it, and it's one of these things where it's going to be a lot of effort, and this is where it's going to get really hard, and you really got to dig your feet in, and you got to make sure that you're probably the one thing that makes people a lot more consistent and have habits here is being prepared. I know a lot of people that do really, really well in the front half of the cycle just doing macro Tetris, but in the back half of the cycle, they have to be prepared, and most of them have to meal prep and make sure that they don't have hyperpalatable foods in the house, because this is when they fall off. And this also coincides, this back half of the cycle also coincides with your weight trending upwards. So this can really play with your mind, because you might be doing everything perfect, but the scale is trending upwards. And we have to understand that that is just a part of the process, and we can't let that get to us and result in us eating more calories and getting off plan. I think that's all I need to mention in regards to neurotransmitters and the ovarian hormones. One kind of funny fact is that, the 3 days leading up to ovulation, your hunger is blunted and your sex drive increases. And I always just find it so incredibly interesting how everything is working towards reproductive success. So right before ovulation, if you have a higher sex drive, and what they say in the literature is actually you get a decrease in hunger for food, but you have an increase in hunger for the flesh, which is kind of just a funny little tidbit I wanted to add in there, because everything is geared towards reproduction, and we have to understand that that's why all of this stuff is going on. All of this is occurring because we're trying to make babies, and we're trying to be as successful as we possibly can, and it's something that is technically out of our control, but this always comes back to what is in our control, is that we can be prepared, we can make sure that we're building habits week in, week out, and being as consistent as we possibly can, and working on your ability to not allow all these factors derail you. And knowledge is power, in the sense where that this stuff is going to be happening, and we just have to do our absolute best to combat this so we